just want to give you guys a reminder, as we have questions throughout the talk, to use the Slido link that I'll be posting in the chat, and also to upvote questions that you'd like to see answered. So yeah, all right, Pastor Tendai, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I think that was a really great introduction. I feel somewhat intimidated by it because it doesn't tell about the dishes that I don't wash or the chores that I don't do at home. My name is Tendai Musikavanhu. I'm married to Gail Musikavanhu. We've been married, this year will be our 27th year of being married. I have 5 children. Yes, I'm trying to populate Africa on my own. 5 children, ranging from 24 years old. In fact, she's turning 25 this year. That's my firstborn, Gail Agnes. Mikau is my second. She's at Wolseley College. She's turning 20, or just turned 22. Then Mongan, my son, is at NYU Shanghai, speaks fluent Mandarin. He's turning 21 this year, and then our twins, Joshua and Sungu, who are turning 17 this year. So we came to the United States about 12 years ago. I'm an asset manager. You heard about the CFA Charter. I'm not sure how many of you know about the CFA Charter. So you see, Wall Street can be saved, right? Last time I checked my Bible, it says every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus is Lord. I'm sure that includes Wall Street knees. I'm sure that includes Main Street needs, White House needs, US Congress needs, and state Congress needs. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess. And so I'm trusting God that because I'm talking to this crowd, the Harvard CFA, that each one of you guys have some sort of idea of what God's plan is for your life. And my hope is that for those of you that want to go into business, I'm going to be talking a lot about business and finance in this discussion. But also those who want to go into any sphere or any field. You know, if you look at Wall Street, it has every single sector listed on the stock exchange: agriculture, food, tech, you name it. And so each one of us end up meeting in the marketplace in the capital marketplace, but equally so even in the public square. So what I'm going to be talking about today is generosity, and really, in a way, debunking myths. And I'm looking forward to your questions. So please be ruthless. You can tell from my accent that I was born on a very tiny island that rains all the time, called the United Kingdom. I was born there because my dad was a freedom fighter from Southern Africa, what used to be called a terrorist, of people who stood up for their rights in South Africa and Zimbabwe. He moved to the UK, and I was born there. And so my heritage is that I'm originally from South Africa, but born in the UK, and now living in Wolseley, Massachusetts. So a bit of a walking United Nations. What I really believe is important is to tell you upfront what generosity is not. It's not about giving people money and stuff. You can give people money and stuff and still not be generous. You can be generous even without giving people money and stuff. It's really the whole package, or as in one of my favorite movies, Jerry Maguire, when Cuba Jr.'s character says it's the qua, it's the whole package, right? It's about the time, the treasures, and the talents. And I'm hoping that by the time we finish, you'll have tons of questions for us to be able to walk through practical questions that you may have about money and God, and various questions about what wealth means and riches mean. And so I've been very fortunate and blessed. I've sat in the Gilded Halls of London, in the city, as they call it, which is the central part of London, the equivalent of Wall Street there. And I've seen how money really influences people, and unfortunately how it can be a god. And so what we're going to do today is start off, if you wouldn't mind turning to the first page. We're going to talk about start off with an executive summary. This is an important statement to start off with, that generosity begins with God. It continues with our faith and has eternal consequences. So here's a verse that all of you hopefully know by heart, for those of you that went to Sunday school. Oh, and by the way, I was introduced as Pastor Tendai. I prefer my proper title, which is Archbishop. I'm working my way to Cardinal, but right now, for now, it's Archbishop. That's what I prefer. Moving along. So John 3:16 is a verse you guys know so well. It's quoted everywhere, especially in football stadiums across the country. So I'm going to read this verse and hopefully shed new light on it. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. There are a couple of things you can see already ringed off there. For God, everything begins with God. If we start to do generosity without it beginning from God, we're lost. It then ceases to begin to be about love and about all the things that matter in generosity, and it begins to be about us, the giver, or about the recipient. Everything has to begin for God. Everything has to begin with God. The second part I want to bring in this verse that we know all too well is whoever believes in him. You see, we've got a role to play. And I love the fact that your group has got the word faith in it, faith in action. I love that. I really pray that each one of you apply faith to your life. And I'll be giving a testimony later on about just how difficult it is to apply faith. But whoever, that's important. In a world driven by identity politics and division and racial division and oppression and et cetera, whoever believes in him. It means that's a call for each one of us to step up and be generous. Whoever believes. And then finally have eternal life. The beautiful thing about whatever we do in this life is we have, whatever we do, whatever we think and say, all of those things have eternal consequences. So to try and reduce it to some sort of logical statement that's sort of quasi-mathematical, God's loving generosity plus our faith equal eternal consequences. And here's where I start applying some mathematics. I love exploring because I really believe that God speaks to us in any different field, whether it's mathematics or English literature, biology or chemistry. I don't know whether God speaks to accounting, but he speaks to all the subjects. And maths is one of my favorite subjects. I love it, and it's obviously applied in finance. And you recognize that symbol there. That's infinity. We're going to be talking a lot about infinity there because it's an interesting. I believe it's the beginning of us beginning to try to understand God. But God's loving generosity is infinite to us. Maths, a true Brit. Yeah, I use the word maths instead of maths. Sorry, not hard to convert, hard to teach an old dog new tricks. But this sign, infinity here. God's love and generosity to us is infinite. And I'm going to show just how luxurious and how over the top, almost how scandalous God's generosity to us is. And because he's been so generous to us, we need to be generous to everybody else. So that generosity is infinite. But our faith sometimes seems the exact opposite. That's why I've put that 1 divided by infinity, which many of the mathematical scholars will tell you approximates 0. As close to 0 as you can get, 1 over infinity. Sometimes our efforts seem completely useless, especially in these times that we've been going through, these lockdown times, where a number of people are struggling with all sorts of mental health and emotional health issues. And our enemy loves it. He loves knocking a person when they're down. And so to many of you, I'm sure he doesn't only visit my home and my mind, he's been visiting you and he's been telling you how inconsequential you are. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter, because infinity plus your 0 still equals infinity. God can still do exceedingly abundantly above what you and I can even begin to believe with our generosity. And what the devil convinces each one of us to do is to give up, is not to take that lottery ticket that God has given you, called your life, and to take it to the again, I'm going to probably use another British term, take it to the booth. I suppose you guys also use the word booth. Take it to the booth and claim your inheritance. And the devil doesn't even want you to do that, because his job is to convince you that you've got a losing lottery ticket, and therefore don't even try. But those of you who love statistics know that 1 chance in a million is better than 0. So I want to encourage you by the end of today to be generous, but to be generous to yourself. That don't let the devil knock you down so far that you begin to believe his lie, that you are truly a 0, because you're not. You're more than that. And with God, the possibilities are infinite. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to read together some word. Amen, 0 to hero. We're going to go through some words together. It's good always to seeing as a Christian organization to start off with a word. So let's talk first of all about how generosity starts with God. So we need to follow his example because it starts with him. We need to follow his example because anything else is not generosity. But we also need to know who owns everything, because sometimes we're led to believe that maybe Warren Buffett or some rich guy owns everything. Psalm 24 verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." That is probably my favorite verse. That is probably the verse that got me into business. Today, I manage a company that runs about $1.3 billion on behalf of our clients. We co-manage that. I'm stepping in faith, and Lord willing, I'll be able to report back to you in a year's time that the Lord has actually, I believe, challenged me to look at acquiring a firm that is multiples our size. It's about 10 times our size. You know what? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. That should give you courage that your Father owns everything. You're a son or a daughter of the one who owns everything. You don't have to beg anybody for anything. If you turn to God and ask, you will receive. So because God owns everything, then we should be looking after our planet. We should be caring for other people, because the planet and those other people belong to God and not us. And in fact, the sign of just how generous God is that God lets us use our planet, this planet, so freely, whether you're good or a bad person. He gives us the planet with such generosity that we actually could be fooled into thinking that we own it when we don't. And you know when I know we don't own it? I've lost friends and relatives because of this COVID pandemic. Young and old people I know have died in this pandemic. It's been shocking, and I know a number of you are in the same boat. What really hit me was somebody of my age group when they passed away. It felt very personal, even more personal, when it was someone close to me who's my age. I think there's a certain amount of invincibility. We lie to ourselves that we're invincible and that everything belongs to us and it's all about us. But when things like that happen, it wakes us up to the fact that we actually are only really here temporarily. We're really, in a way, squatters. We're not here for long. It's important to remember that the Lord owns everything. And so we need to hear from him what we should be doing with our lives, with what he's given us, the treasures, and the skills and the talents he's given us, our talents. So our time, our treasures, and our talents should be given to him because they all belong to him. And that's generosity. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 3 is quite a sobering verse. It says, "If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship, that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." That's harsh. Some versions actually say, if I give my body over to be burnt, but if I do it unlovingly, I have nothing. Proverbs 12 verse 10 says, this is very interesting, this verse, especially the second part of the verse. "The righteous care for the needs of the animals, but the kindest acts of the wicked are cruel." That means that if wicked people try to be kind, it's still wickedness. And what does that mean? It means that generosity is qualified by the source and the motive of the giver. In order to be generous, we need to be motivated by love and righteousness. Otherwise, even our best efforts may actually cause harm. That's quite sobering. It means that generosity is not defined as the world defines it, because it's defined by our hearts and our motive, and which means God is the ultimate one who determines whether we were generous or not. We move to the next slide. The next step is it continues with our faith. Now, this is the hardest part because we need to believe. We read together Hebrews 11, verse 6. It says, "And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." To so many people, it feels like being generous feels like subtraction. Giving feels like you have to be less when you give. It feels that way. This is exactly why we cannot rely on feelings. We have to rely on faith to be generous. We also need not to seek out recognition from people around us, but to seek our recognition from God, because he is the ultimate existence and he is the ultimate rewarder. That's what that verse means. Why are we giving? What is our motive? It comes back to that same question, but it's impossible to do it without faith. Remember this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. So what's interesting is, because generosity is based on faith, a good guide as to how much faith you're employing can be seen by the attitude you have when you give. If you're giving reluctantly, or if we get to the point where we're overwhelmed, or we feel underappreciated, or lacking, or if we give to meet a very selfish need, our attitude will show this. And that is why faith in God is the only sustainable fuel for giving. So what does sowing sparingly mean when you look at the following verse? Let's go to the following verse together. That's Mark 12, verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. It's interesting. So this is the next slide. Sorry, next slide. So let me start reading that again. Mark 12, verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. It's interesting that Jesus was actually interested in money. I grew up thinking that Jesus didn't like us having money. I remember thinking that, and growing up with the saying, money is the root of all evil. That is probably one of the biggest lies in Christendom. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. Jesus was here watching money, watching our people react with money. And I believe he does that today. That he watches what we do, who we give to, and why we give. I've heard it said that if you were to go through a person's bank statements, you can summarize the person's wants and who they are by what they spend their money on. Jesus looks at what we spend our money on. He looks even deeper than that. He looks at our heart. So he's there, sitting at the temple treasury. Let me continue the reading. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came in, put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." Now, let's just pause there for a second, and let's talk about something very close to home, next page, and that's my testimony, before I go into this verse. When I was trying to think of which testimony I should give, I really was stuck, because I could speak on a number of different things about how generous the Lord has been to me and how I've learned how important generosity is. So let me give you probably the most fundamental testimony as quickly as I can, which is in the next 2.5 hours. That is, I remember when we moved over to the United States, we put a huge amount of money into the initiative of our company coming over here. We listed the first 5 ETFs, exchange traded funds, on the stock exchange, New York Stock Exchange. And we're the first African company to do so. Tons of cash, money I didn't have, I invested in this. Big faith, came over with my wife and 5 kids. And as we arrived in Worsley, Mass, I'm not sure how many of you know Worsley, Mass. Certainly then it wasn't diverse, it still isn't that diverse. It's a lovely town. Lord willing, it becomes much more inclusive as things go on. But what's amazing is we faced a number of disappointments. And God did not stop requiring that I give my tithe and I give my offering, that I give to people's lives. I continue to pastor. My wife pastors too. We continue to serve in our community. We had to continue to be faithful. And I remember getting quite disappointed by the fact that it seemed as though we hadn't yet received our breakthrough, yet God wanted me to continue to be faithful in all the things he wanted me to be faithful in. That sort of feels unfair. We sort of want it the other way around, right? We want God to be faithful to us first. We want God to give us all the things we want right now first. And then, because I'm so happy, God, that you've done all this good stuff for me, then guess what? I'm going to do all the stuff you want me to do. That's very rarely the way God works. He wants us to move in faith, which means that we often have to do things believing in the unseen and hoping for things that aren't even tangible. And part of testing whether we really do believe and trust in God is whether we can continue to serve God even when we don't feel like doing so because our breakthrough hasn't come through yet. I'll never forget, and I'll truncate this, how the Lord revealed to me in Psalm 23 that I was going through the valley of the shadow of death in terms of my finances. I had spent millions that I honestly did not have. I had to borrow it. I remember standing at one train station. What he's doing, but I need to trust him. And I had to preach the next Sunday on faith. And I think God has a great sense of humor. I think what he does is he puts us in situations that test what's really inside. You see, if you take a toothpaste tube and you squeeze it, what's going to come out? Toothpaste. And how do you know that? Because you've done it before. When you squeeze a Christian, what should come out? Expletives? Smashing stuff around you? Smoking people? Jesus, someone says, hallelujah. Jesus should come out. Faith should come out. If anything else comes out of you when you're squeezed, it's probably because it needed to come out so that Jesus could go in. So that's my testimony, that when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that very next verse says, but you set a table before me and mine enemies, and my cup overflows. When God had revealed to me that that verse was applicable to my situation and that I would have a time of rejoicing, I had to start rejoicing in faith before it had even become real and practical. What is amazing is I was sitting on one of the most beautiful beaches in the world in Cape Town, South Africa, with 3 of my clients in the biggest transaction that Old Mutual South Africa, which was my partner at that time, had seen in their 175-year history, just several weeks later. That's the God we serve. He can suddenly turn things around, and he has everything. and he is generous and he loves us. So he will give us what we need. The question is, are we ready for what he wants to give us? That is always the question. So going back to the story of the widow, if we go to the next slide, we come to the final section now where we're talking about eternal and infinite consequences. You see, the ripple effects of godly generosity cannot be determined by mathematics. Let's go through that verse again. In Mark 12, verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings are put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." We've just read a verse that says, those who sow sparingly will reap sparingly. In other words, as we say in South Africa and England, those who are stingy will not reap rewards, right? So, but those who are generous shall reap abundant. The widow only gave a few cents. Isn't that sowing sparingly? Surely that means sowing sparingly. Well, not really. Because as we see here, it really is about attitude. It really is about faith. It really is about how much you trust God. So here we have this equation, minus x plus infinity. What's interesting is that if we say x is any integer between 0 and infinity, then this equation is true, right? That if you add anything to infinity, it still remains infinity, as long as it's a positive integer. But what's interesting is that you could have minus lack. You could have worse than 0, and you add it to infinity, and it'll still be infinity. That should be a reminder that even when we're in seemingly infinite lack, and I put those in quotation marks, God's infinite provision is still more than enough. So therefore, nobody has an excuse. All of us have a duty to be generous. If you're a Christian that's living a faith-filled life, then all of us have a duty to be generous. There are no excuses. Now, what's interesting is I can't decide whether the devil is a liar or bad at math or maths or both. Because here's what he convinces us. He convinces us about this equation at the bottom of the page, that minus infinity plus infinity equals 0. Now, let me ask that question. Is that true? Minus infinity plus infinity equals 0? That sort of feels true, right? Minus infinity plus infinity equals 0. Or infinity minus infinity equals 0. That sort of feels correct. And the reason why he convinces us to do that is he tells us that we have infinite needs. In fact, our infinite needs are so terrible that they're going to overwhelm God. And God's not going to be able to provide us what we want. The reality of that equation is not actually correct, even though it feels emotionally correct. The equation on the next page is actually correct. That minus infinity plus infinity is actually indeterminate. Now, let me walk through that. And I know some of you are English majors. I know this is not Shakespeare. I know you don't feel like doing this. I know you're screaming, kicking into this pool. Let's go into this pool together. I also love Shakespeare. Yeah, I think he's a great rapper. So the point here is, if you take, I called you out because I'm one of you. He is a rapper. Shakespeare's a rapper. Anyway, I'll carry on. So minus infinity plus infinity, why is it indeterminate? Well, let's look at infinity. Just imagine this is infinity. What I'm doing in my hands here is infinity. A whole lot of numbers that never end. Now, what's interesting about integers is you can split those numbers into odd numbers and even numbers, right? English majors are still with me, right? Right? Even numbers, odd numbers. what's interesting is that both of those sequences are also infinite. Isn't that interesting? You've got infinite odd numbers and infinite even numbers. Now, you can subtract those even odd numbers from those even infinite, oh, there's my alarm going off. You can subtract those infinite odd numbers from the infinite even numbers. And what's interesting is you could still have infinity. That's one possible scenario. The second scenario is you could have minus infinity, because what you could do is you could take both sets of even and odd numbers from one set of just odd numbers and end up with a minus infinity, right? So that's another scenario. And you could have a third scenario where you actually have all the infinite numbers minus all the infinite numbers, and it could indeed equal 0. But the problem is infinity is not stable. It doesn't stand still. So what does this tell us? Well, firstly, it shows us that when the devil convinces us that our needs are infinite and that even with an infinite God, that our needs will not be met, or worse, that they may overwhelm God, that's a lie, because there is not one answer to this equation. That's even if you accept the fact that you have minus infinite needs, and that's also impossible. No one has infinite needs, even though it may feel so. But the second thing it shows is our lives are determined not by how things appear to our limited logic and our limited rationality, but what they truly are in the hands of our infinite God. You see, our lives and our consequences are indeterminate. God is the one who determines. This is not something that can be rationalized or worked out, which means that generosity is not limited to mathematics. It is not limited to mathematics, but it is completely opened up by faith. Amen. We reached the final slide. We talked a lot about infinity today, and it's a hard number to get your mind around. But I was reading a couple of pages of NASA and a couple of things, and my wife loves perseverance and the fact that they landed on Mars. Was one preacher in Africa pronounced it perseverance. So she loves perseverance. And I was just looking at the fact that, I don't know whether you know that recently we've just realized, we thought that there were 200 billion galaxies in the observable universe, 200 billion galaxies. It turns out we were a factor of 10 too unambitious. It's actually 2 trillion galaxies. Okay, so now I've come to the realm of physics. So we've left the realm of mathematics now, we're now in physics. Do you know what that means? Because with numbers like these, they sometimes sound like silly numbers. The next number that you see, there's 2.4 billion, or actually rounded up 2.5 billion. That's the number of seconds the average American, yeah, we're going to come back to English. Well, I'm speaking in English. So you guys have had the show all the time. So that 2.4 billion is the whole existence of the average American. Just over 78 years, 2.4 billion seconds. What it means is that even if you were not to sleep, eat or drink, or do anything else, but just spend 1 second of your whole life looking at every single observable galaxy, and some of them are really difficult to observe, that you would be overwhelmed by the generosity that God has in the number of galaxies that are actually out there. That's how lavishly God loves us, that what he has given us to enjoy and to observe and to bring glory to his name, we don't even have enough time to accept all the generosity and love that he has for him. And that's the most amazing thing about faith and about this whole thing of generosity, is that we need to exemplify what our Father does to us. I'll end with this. We went to the Grand Canyon. Okay, so now we're bringing earth science into this. And as we went to the Grand Canyon, what shocked me is, oh, there's some earth scientists who are happy now. what shocked me about the Grand Canyon was that my family and I didn't have too much time to spend there. We spent maximum a couple of hours a day and then we'd come back. But when I looked at how much time was spent forming those rocks, billions of years spent forming those beautiful rocks in the Grand Canyon, again, the lavishness and the generosity of God became clear to me. That God knew that my family and I and any other family that goes to visit that place is not going to have much time available, but he overwhelmed in terms of the amount of time he prepared for us anyway. That's the God we serve. And that's the God I'm going to encourage each one of us today listening to this talk to be as generous, or to aim and to emulate, to be as generous as the God we serve, and to do so in faith. Let me open up to questions, and I'd love to hear any thoughts any of you have got.
Wow. That was an amazing talk. Probably, I would say, like, I don't know, I'm thinking back to my math teachers who told me, you'll use math in like practical situations, and yeah, seems like they were right. So yeah, we'll be opening up to questions now. I'll just go ahead and start. I'll pull up the Slido. So the top question we have right now is, how do we know if our generosity comes from the right place?
Jesus says you can tell a tree by its fruit. So you call a lemon tree a lemon because it produces lemons, right? Same thing, that you'll be able to tell people who exercise generosity from God, the source, they'll produce godliness. In fact, a very good measure is when you give, are you giving without wanting any recognition, without wanting anybody to see, or are you doing it so that you can have a photo of? I think a lot of Hollywood has come under some scrutiny for very celebrity type giving, giving with all the TV cameras showing you giving to this poor person in the street. That is wrong for so many reasons. It's wrong because it's undignifying the person who's receiving the gift, but it's also wrong because it's coming from a place of wanting to elevate oneself above another, and it's bringing no glory to God. So by the fruit, the measure of what you produce when you give is an important way of telling where you're coming from.
Thank you so much for that question, Archbishop. Another question, well, there are a lot of questions that are coming in.
Yay.
So another one is there a level of affluence in terms of money, stuff, free time, anything which would indicate to a Christian that he or she's giving too little?
Oh yeah, this is such a cool one. So I went out for a run. One day I must tell you guys my story. Running for me is a miracle. I used to be one of those people who hated running, didn't like running at all. Anyway, that's another story. I went for a run with a friend, and we passed by this really beautiful Mercedes-Benz, one of those low-cut cars, the sort where, Mason, running. Okay, I'll tell you a bit of my testimony. I was about 300 pounds at one stage of my life, and God did a miracle, and I lost it, and thankfully I've kept it off. It keeps on trying to come back, but I'm fighting it. Anyway, as I told you, it was another story. So there we are. We see this beautiful low-cut Mercedes-Benz, a sort of Mercedes-Benz that you almost have to kneel down to get into. I mean, it looks like a racing car, like one of those Formula One cars. And my friend, who's quite wealthy, quite wealthy, quite affluent, turns around to me and he says, "This is disgusting. Why would you want to spend so much money on a car?" This is what my friend says to me. So I said to him, okay, so let's say you won a lottery and you had $1 billion. Is it bad if you spend $120,000 on a Mercedes-Benz? He said, yeah, you should give it to the poor, you should do et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He had reasons that he thought you should do the money. But when I asked him, I said, no, seriously, you've got $1 billion, tell me what you're going to do with your money. It dawned on him. that he had a certain perspective that he had begun to judge other people. So the correct answer to that equation is, when you get $1 billion, we go back to the source and we say, God, what do you want me to do with that $1 billion? I've just won the lottery. What do you want me to do with that $1 billion? Okay, firstly, tithe. Okay, thank you, Lord, I tithe. Right, then what? And God will show each one of the people on this call different uses for that $1 billion. But the point is, it'll be God's plan. And because you're doing it for God's purposes, you don't have to be afraid. God might actually tell you to give every single dime of that away. You need to do it, trusting God that he'll give you another $1 billion or another how much to live on. God may tell you to put aside some of it into education or various other things. I really can't go through the various permutations, but the key thing is that we need to go back to God with whatever we've got, whether it's money, whether it's our time, whether it's our talents. Let's talk about time for a second. There are people who want you to do stuff for them, who want you to help them out in this cause and that cause. You need to treat your time as if it's $1 billion lottery ticket winning. That's what I'm telling you. So you need to go to God and say, God, what am I going to do with my time? What do you want me to do with my time? How should I spend this portfolio of time that you've given me? Because guess what? It isn't yours. You have to give it back at some stage. There's a reckoning for it. So the same question that can be asked of $1 billion, that can be asked of a lifetime, is the same thing that can be asked then about your intellect and your skill and your charm and your beauty and your handsomeness, your je ne sais quoi. All of those things need to be used for God's glory.
Oh, that's a really great response. Moving on to the next question. Does God want some of us to be poor our entire earthly lives?
Wow. So I read through the Bible, and I'm reading through Job. How many of you guys know the book of Job? Just raise your hands on the camera if we've read through the book of Job, right? It's not uplifting reading, right, for the first couple of chapters. In fact, the first chapter almost looks like dark comedy, that it goes so badly wrong for Job that you're either going to burst out crying or burst out laughing. His friends, it says, they sat for 7 days. They couldn't even talk to him for 7 days because this is how depressing this whole situation looked. Poverty is interesting. Poverty is a bit like zero or minus infinity. Just like riches, you could argue, is tending to infinity. Poverty is actually not what we think it is. We tend to think of it in terms of monetary terms. But you can be poor with $1 million in your bank account. The Bible says, I've seen princes walking barefoot, and I've seen beggars riding on horses. What does the Bible mean by that? That poverty is actually a state of here. It's a state of well-being. There are depressed people who can feel suicidal, sitting in mansions with cars and helicopters waiting outside. And there are poor people who can barely scrape 2 meals together, who love their children, love their spouses, and love life, and enjoy the sunset and the sunrise. Poverty is quite interesting in that as a financial person, I automatically think about dollars and cents, but poverty is a matter of the soul. It's more a matter of the soul than we actually would care to believe. So then the question is, can God call us to poverty? No. Paul said, I've had much and I've had little. And he says that in all of those, God has given me enough. God is the God of enough. He's not the God of poverty. There is no glory in being poor, financially poor. Poor people will tell you that. There's nothing glorious about it. It's an ancient Greek mythology that sort of talks about this benefit of being poor as opposed to rich and the virtues of being poor. That's not really true. Money is a neutral agent. It's really about what we are like inside. I'll end with this to the question. We were sitting in an auditorium full of investors, all Wall Street types, and this speaker was talking to us about, it was in the middle of the Great Recession, so everyone was depressed. And they were saying, right, what is the definition of happiness? And they were talking about this from a behavioral economic point of view and psychological point of view. And they said that they'd done their analyses, and quite interestingly, 40% of happiness can be defined or is determined by your genetic makeup. Circumstance, which everybody believes is what makes you happy or sad, actually only counts for 10%. Now, poverty is a circumstance. Only counts for 10% of your happiness. The other 10% are random items that are hard to measure. What surprised everybody in the auditorium, it literally drew gaps, was the other 40% is attitude and coping mechanisms, cognitive therapeutic habits, whatever you want to call it, all summarized by attitude, or what we would summarize as faith. And he gave the example that if you're a person prone to depression and something amazing happens in your life, it'll be great for 2 weeks, and then you'll revert back to who you really were before you received that great thing in your life. Equally so, if you're prone to happiness in your life, you can have a really terrible circumstance and it'll throw you off course for a couple of weeks, but you'll revert to who you are when that circumstance is gone. The thing about poverty is it is a trial, and God does not call us to poverty. He calls us to having enough. That's what God calls us to. And in fact, because he's so generous, he calls us to having more than enough. But that does not mean that we don't go through trials. And that does not mean that there are people who live in poverty who love the Lord and serve the Lord. But he will provide enough for them too. Any more questions?
Yes, thank you so much. I was processing that. I'm so sorry. The next question is...
And by the way, let me just talk about enough for a second, because when I say enough, a lot of people think about that in dollars and cents. They think, oh no, the average GDP per capita in the United States is 64,000. So therefore enough means I must get 64,000 per month. That is not enough. You can have the 100 billion plus that Elon Musk has, and that still may not be enough. Enough is again another sense of what is inside. It's not a monetary number.
I agree with that. Thank you very much. The next question is, how do we reconcile some high-paying positions that depend on the underpaying of poor workers? Can Christians occupy those positions in good faith?
Wow, I hope this question and answer thing does not end. I'm loving these questions, and I might even have a few of my own. So interesting. In a market economy where people openly bid for labor and talent, we should let people, Q&A could go on infinity. Yeah, exactly, as if we've got infinite time, right? I told you I only have 2.4 billion seconds, and I've chomped into a big chunk of mine already. But no, going back to the point about high-paid jobs. The world, especially if you look at how a lot of this philosophical discussion started off with Karl Marx's Das Kapital, lives in a zero-sum game where everything is determined by a dialectical materialism. That's just fancy speak for everything. Sorry, now I've come to the social scientists. Social scientists say, woohoo, right? So dialectical materialism is quite interesting because it doesn't allow for metaphysical existence. It doesn't allow for what can't be explained or detected by the senses. And yet there's so much that cannot be explained by money, dollars and cents, rich and poor, oppressed and not oppressed. So my answer to that is, as a Christian, you should always be salt and light. You should be salt and light. What does that mean? It means in the rotting, festering wound that is the world today, you as a Christian need to be the source of disinfecting and bring in some sort of antiseptic sense to the world, but it means you're going to sting people and they're going to hate you for it. So if you're being a true Christian, you need to be stinging and offending people, just like Jesus did. Jesus offended a lot of people. Light is offensive to somebody who's been in the dark, or when they're waking up in the morning and you draw back the curtain and the light shines in. That is offensive. So there are times, there is all the time actually, when a Christian, no matter what they're doing, no matter what job they're in, they are supposed to be looking for how they can offend for goodness and for God's glory, how they can change things. So there is, especially the more authority God gives you, God is going to be holding each one of us to account for how we use that authority. Whether that authority is in the home, whether that authority is in business, whether that authority is in government, God is going to hold us to account. And so that means we should not, for example, walk into a situation where it is clear that we're oppressing people. If you walk into an environment where it is clear that, for example, discrimination against women is happening, or child labor is happening, you should speak up. And the reason why you should speak up is because you know that your salary is not paid for by your boss. Your salary is paid for by God. Now, the question is, how should you do it? That is the question. Because not everything is about shouting and confrontation. God will give you the wisdom on how to do it. And maybe your wisdom is actually being the best person in your job so that you get promoted to being a Joseph or Daniel, where you actually can affect change because now you're in charge. That's one way. So it's not about holding up a picket sign and saying, hey, increase worker salaries. Hey, that works sometimes, but a lot of the time it doesn't work in business.
Wow, great answer. Next question. What are ways as students we can be generous if we don't have much money?
Yeah. So the beautiful thing about the equation that I mentioned of time, treasure, and talents, even if you have 0 treasures, you've got time and you've got talents. So give that generously. Invest your time, invest your talents, your skills. All of you on this call at university, and a lot of you at Harvard, and the point is, in terms of intellect and skill and talent, people would call you the la creme de la creme, right? The point is, God's going to hold you to account for that. What are you doing with it? The devil's job is to shame you and tell you that you don't have anything. His job is to tell you to take the one talent that God's given you, to dig it in a hole, cover it up, and sit down in a corner and feel sorry for yourself and say, woe is me. I lack this and I lack that. And you know what? I'm just going to keep this talent hidden and be humble and be Christian about it. That is not Christian. God is going to come and ask you what you did with your talent. Boo. That's the truth. God is going to ask you for your talent. He's going to ask you for reckoning and say, I gave you this. And then you're going to say, yeah, but nobody else could see it. Nobody else could see that I was meant to be a ballet dancer. God will say to you, I told you you're a ballet dancer. You know that you're a ballet dancer, Tendai. No, sorry. Not me. You know that you're meant to be a ballet dancer. And the point is, you know that you could have actually done amazing things with that talent. Freudian slip, exactly. Freudian slip. We're going to psychology now. You know that you're a talent. And the point is, that's the problem about approval addiction, is that that's the thing about faith. Faith is about faith in God, not faith in humanity. We don't have faith in each other and faith in ourselves. We need to have faith in God. He's the one who basically adjudicates whether what you're doing is correct or not, period. He's the one who's given you the talent. If you're on Oprah 40 years ago, don't listen to the people who tell you that you can't do it. Do it, because God gave you that talent. Now everybody nods and claps as if we all knew that Oprah was an amazing person from the beginning. But guess what? I'm telling you, though, many people told her that she has no business in show business. I'm telling you that many people told her she did not have the look. I'm telling you that many people told her that she's not male enough, right? She's not white enough, whatever enough you want to put there. And that's why the generosity of our time and the generosity of our talents cannot rely on waiting for everybody to give you permission to live your life.
Thank you so much for that, Archbishop. Another question is, should our tithing go beyond the 10%? And is that 10% pre-tax or is that 10% post-tax?
You know what, guys? Come on. This is fun. I'm sorry, I'm a geek. I'm just having so much fun because these are true Christian questions in finance. And sorry, I'm sort of gushing on this. But anyway, so no, I don't apologize for the question. I love the question. I love the question. So, okay, vulnerability time. When I started off tithing, I tithed on my net. And I was there in Cape Town, a broke Christian. And I was looking to get married. I had a fiance. I got married to Miss World, at least I thought she was. And I didn't have, barely had 2 copper coins to rub together, right? I mean, I had to save up for a wedding, and you know weddings are too expensive and all the rest of it. So I started giving God reasons as to why I shouldn't tithe on the gross. And then one day God just simply said to me, okay, you've been tithing on net, and I'm happy with that. What about tithing on gross? What do you think about that? And you know what? I sort of don't like it when God asks me questions because he already knows the answer. So it's not as if this is an educational exercise for God. He's not trying to get information. He's actually trying to tell me what's in my heart. Whenever God asks a question in the Bible, he's not asking it from the point of view of him wanting information. He wants to make sure that the person who's asking the question has information, receives information. And so he said, what if we increase this to gross? What do you think about that? And I knew straight away that I had to. So I tithed on gross. Do you know that the Lord has blessed me financially in so many ways from that moment when I decided to trust him when the math was not adding up? So the whole thing about tithe is it is really about trusting God. It is really about the fact, I remember sitting with my mother when I was about 12, and again, the accounts just weren't adding up. And she was getting stressed. And I turned on to her and I said, she was a nurse working for, in the public sector at that time. And I remember, and I just become a Christian. And I said to her, you know what, why don't we trust God, Mom? Because you're really stressed. So here's the thing. If 1 + 1 = 2 stresses you out, does that change the equation? I just want to ask the question here. If 1 + 1 = 2 stresses you out, that number stretches you out, and that equation stretches you out. By stressing, does it change the equation? Does the equation all of a sudden say, oh no, Tendai's stressed out by this. I need to make sure that 1 + 1 = 3. Let's try and do that for today, for tonight. Does that ever work? It never does. So what's the use of stressing? There is no use. But we do it anyway. We need to trust God. We need to trust God. In Philippians 4, verse 6 and 7, this is the Prozac for every Christian. Philippians 4, verse 6 and 7. Memorize that verse, especially during these tough times. Because it starts off by saying, do not be anxious over anything. That's a beautiful start to the equation, right? Do not be anxious over anything, but in every situation, with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace that transcends all understanding will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. What does that mean? Let's look at the end. Guards your heart and your mind. In other words, mental health and emotional health comes from prayer. Put differently, the less you pray, the more anxious and stressed out you're going to be. So every time you begin to stress, that should be an alarm clock for saying, I need to pray. I'm stressed. That's what I've been doing, and it works for me. And I have a lot of reason to be stressed out. Wall Street is stressful, people. It is stressful. Any other queries?
Yeah, we have some more. Yeah, if the widow gave all she had, does that mean that more wealthy people should give as much as they possibly can?
So how many of you guys know that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, multi-billionaires, gave away the majority of their money? Do you guys know that story? How many people know that story? Okay, a couple of you know that story. These guys woke up to what's in the Bible, right? But they don't even know it. To them, it's just rational. They realized they have got far more money than they need. And at the time, Buffett had about 34 billion US dollars. And apparently what he did is he put aside some money in trust for his kids. And then the rest he gave away. And he started, then Bill and Melinda Gates followed, and a couple of other people followed. And so now, right now, their benevolent trusts are bigger than their actual personal assets. Now, that's a wake-up call. That's following what the widow did in the Bible, billionaire style, right? Only thing with the widow in the Bible is that she literally gave 100%. These guys are giving 95%. And keeping 5% of $1 billion, you're still doing pretty well. So the point is, absolutely, we are supposed to, that story, that occurrence is in the Bible because it showed us a couple of things. Number one, that Jesus is observing what we do with our money. Why? Because it shows what's in our hearts. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. That's a Bible verse. In other words, you all know where your wallet is, right? It's somewhere in the vicinity. You don't even need a radar. You need a radar for your car keys, but you don't need a radar for this, right? You know where this thing is, right? And we know where our finances stand. And so what that shows is the widow was able to take everything and trust God with everything. And she was told as an example to all of us that we need to get to the stage where we can actually trust God with everything. And let me tell you, I am actually at that stage of my life right now where I'm trusting God with this situation, this breakthrough situation that I believe I'll be able to testify to you to one day. I'm having to trust God. It literally has got to the point where the sums of money involved are too big. And so I have to trust God for his amazing generosity. And I have to trust God that he's got my back. Any other questions?
I'm still on the don't stress, and half of us are here stressing about not stressing. Okay, so what are ways that you've been generous after achieving success in the business sphere? I mean, I listed some of them, but you can expand on that.
Wow. So let me tell you a story about how generosity is the best. It's beautiful because, as we've just been experiencing today, it's partnering with God. You're partnering with God. If you do it right, you're partnering with God. And that's a great and exciting life, to partner with God. Whether you're partnering with God because you've determined to give your life to going on a mission to one part of the world, that is being generous with your life. And let me tell you, you're going to live the most exciting, yes, stressful, but most exciting life you could ever live if you gave your life to something like that and you're called to do it and you do it out of faith. So there are a number of things I've done, and I pause it because I want to receive the heavenly rewards that are going to be there for me. So I'm not going to tell you a lot of the stuff I've done, because the Bible says if I tell you and you guys go, oh, Pastor Tendai, wow, he's a great guy, I lose my reward, right? That's a Bible verse, right? So I'm not going to tell you a lot of the stuff. I'm not going to tell you a lot of the stuff I've done. But let me give you one example of how partnering with God can be beautiful. So we started this foundation, this foundation. I'll keep it vague. And in South Africa, because of apartheid, a lot of intelligent Black men and women, young boys and girls, don't have a chance because their parents are not educated. And education is still very racially segregated in that beautiful country. And the government in the apartheid era would spend 20 times the money on white children than they would on black children, more than 20 times the money per child. And so the Lord revealed to me that there's some geniuses literally chasing chickens and herding goats in the rural areas. The next cure for cancer could be a little kid in Guatemala or a kid in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, or in the outback in Australia, in the dustiest, dirtiest part. That is how God rolls. God often brings the most obscure people to have the most powerful impact. And here's the thing, not all of those people are being discovered. So we then wanted to, and this is just a way to encourage you to think about how you partner with God. And so we wanted to change that. And we thought, let's go out there and find the best and brightest kids out there and send them to the best schools, because education is actually one of the best levelers of playing fields. The short and long of it is we found this one kid, and you guys can Google this kid's name. His first name is Sia, that's spelled S-I-Y-A, and his surname is Xuza. In South Africa, we have clicks in our language. Xuza, which is X-U-Z-A. So let me tell you about Sia, since it's a public story already. We were having a debate as this foundation because Sia, unlike most of the really bright kids that we sent to the best schools in South Africa, actually came from a relatively wealthy family. His family wasn't wealthy enough to send him to the best schools, but it was good enough so he could have just eked by and maybe got an okay degree and got an okay job. But this kid was 14 years old and was already a member of the Rocket Society of South Africa at the age of 14 as a black kid, which in South Africa is a double miracle. In fact, the black kid is more of a miracle than the 14-year-old part, because unfortunately racism still exists. So he would explode things in his mom's kitchen. So what happens is we had a debate as the foundation trustees, and as we had this debate, the question was, let's not fund him, let's fund other kids who are poorer than him, right? The debate happened, and then eventually one of the trustees stood up and said, guys, we actually did this to bring kids like this out of obscurity. Let's fund this kid regardless of how wealthy he is. Let's send him to the best schools. His teacher intervened in such a powerful way in that he put a science project at a science fair. The judges couldn't judge the efficacy of what he had actually produced. They couldn't understand it. So they gave him an ungraded type of certificate. The science teacher went back to these guys and said, do you know what this kid's just invented? You guys obviously don't understand what he's put together. And they said, well, it's too late now. Let him submit for next year. So he submitted the next year. He was 17 years old that year. Not only did he win the science fair, but he was awarded the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor in South Africa, the highest award that can be, award recognition that can be given a civilian, rather. He also won a second one that had only been given to Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu at the age of 17 for what he invented. The Nobel Laureate Committee heard of what he had invented and invited him as a guest of honor to the Nobel ceremony at the age of 17. Then NASA heard what this kid had come up with and had an international science fair. Apparently they have these international science fairs quite frequently. He won his category. The prize was that they were going to name a collection of asteroids just outside the solar system after him. So he won that prize. If you Google, you'll find him and you'll find the asteroids that are named after him, by NASA because of what he invented. Here's what this guy invented. This guy invented or came up with a solution to the problem that I think a number of you know that space challenge that went to space exploded and killed a teacher from New England. And it was a very tragic occurrence that happened about 20 years or so ago. And that's because rocket fuel is unstable by its very nature. This kid had been able to develop solid rocket fuel. Most rocket fuel is gaseous and liquid. He had developed solid rocket fuel that was able to overcome the density of solids and breach the 50% barrier that NASA, with its billions of dollars to that date, had not developed a technique to do it. This kid had done it in a science lab. Exactly, that's the link, Siamulela, that's his first name. This kid had done it in a science lab at high school. So that's why I'm saying, be generous with your time, your treasures, and your talents, because it comes from God. And if you're finding that you're opposed, that people are telling you can't do it, that's probably even more of a reason to give generously your time, your treasures, and talents.
Wow, wow. Giabonga, Archbishop. Giabonga Kakulu. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're speaking Zulu.
Ngifunda isiZulu esikoleni.
Wow.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Yes, so it's 9:30, so questions and answers is sadly over. However, I'll be emailing you a lot.
Love to help. And also, I'm obviously at the beck and call of HCFA tonight. If any of you do want to stay afterwards, please do so. I love, you guys energize me. I think I'm young, but to be honest, I'm not so young. So I'm energized by young people. And, I'd love to answer any questions you've got or pray with any of you or anything like that for the next couple of minutes, if the HCFA will allow it.
I'm the MC, so Ursa. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So let's just move on with the program for now, and we'll definitely get back to that. So we'll have our doxology now.